So, Bob Savic, what is the future of EU-Asian trade in the light of US tariffs? Tell us what you know.
Thank you very much, Humphrey, for your very kind introduction. Yes, the future of the European Union and Asian trade is a fascinating story, I think, which is going to unfold in years, if not a couple of generations to come. I think we're likely to see both bold steps forward and unfortunately some negative steps back. I think shortly following the US reciprocal tariffs back in April on so-called Liberation Day, the European Union, I believe, looked very much favorably at Asia in relation to its future trade prospects. Several major EU and Asian government summits were held and are still to be held. One of those, of course, was the EU-China summit that was held in July between Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa of the European Council, alongside China's President Xi Jinping and its Prime Minister Li Qiang. And from all accounts, the discussions were very positive, including discussions in relation to more sensitive matters such as human rights, Xinjiang and Hong Kong, amongst others, as well as trade issues in relation to the EU's lack of market access to the Chinese economy, in particular areas such as digital services, healthcare, the financial industry, and several others. And I believe that headway was made in numerous areas in each of these. And from all accounts, as I've mentioned previously, there looked to be as if both the EU and China were likely to make a significant headway in their relationship, following on from this major summit. But the question then comes down to how do these two parties engage with each other? And I think that's important. At this point in time, it seems to be mainly dialogue driven, which in itself is not a bad way to proceed. But unless there is a legalization of their relationship, unless they both engage in regulatory alignment and treaties and formal agreements, I think it's very difficult for these two parties to really push effectively forward. They attempted to do so back in 2018 to 2020 with the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment between the EU and China. But that, for various reasons, basically seemed to freeze without any further steps forward. And without the unfreezing of discussions and a final potential ratification of the CAI, as it's called, I think it's very difficult for China and for the EU to develop a much more mature and a more advanced relationship. And I say that partly because in recent days, the European Union has agreed with the United States a framework agreement on trade and other matters, which I think will impinge heavily on the EU-China relationship. The EU-US framework agreement covers, I think, areas which are very new to trade deals. In fact, they go far beyond trade deals. They really focus on intensely geopolitical matters. And the framework agreement is replete with notions of economic security between the US and the EU on issues in relation to national security, and many others, which I think is going to make it very difficult for the EU to progress its relations with China. For instance, the EU-US agreement covers um, their effectively sort of strong relationship on critical minerals. Both the EU and the US within the framework agreement look to cooperate very closely in how critical minerals are developed between the two of them. China, of course, accounts for 60% of the world's critical minerals in terms of its extraction and mining, and 90% of its processing and refining. And this agreement, this framework agreement, basically looks to set up intensive cooperation in terms of how the EU and the US effectively look to battle, I would say, against China's virtual monopoly situation in the global market. One has to bear in mind that critical minerals are important for defensive weapons, for medical devices like MRI scanners, for cars, for semiconductors, integrated circuits. So this is a very, very important area for the US and the EU to work closely on. And it seems from this agreement that it's something that they're going to work in combination with against China. It goes beyond critical minerals, of course. We're looking even at now strategic industries of different kinds. For instance, steel and aluminium, where the US has threatened 50% tariffs. The two parties have agreed that there will not be 50% tariffs imposed on the European Union. Instead, they will be looking to, as it's termed in the agreements, establish a ring fencing of how they cooperate in steel and aluminium. The agreement looks at technology standards and potential technology leakage, as the agreement refers to it. And so potentially you're looking at the EU and the US essentially developing their own global standards on technology, very much, I believe, pitted against how China develops its own technology standards. So these are just a few of the examples that can be seen in this EU-US framework agreement. And it was something that came as something of a bit of a surprise to observers. For a time after the Liberation Day tariffs, as I've mentioned, the EU looked as if it was going to perhaps flex its muscles as a global economic powerhouse. It had threatened counter tariffs against the US of up to 30% on essentially around 100 billion or so of US goods, but none of that materialized in the end. Eventually, the EU seemed to almost, I feel, kowtow to the US in terms of US trade interests, in terms of US economic security interests, and it effectively puts potential relationships with China especially, but maybe even much of Asia, in doubt in future years to come, because the EU effectively now becomes tethered to US foreign policy in both trade and in non-trade matters. There are also other issues that perhaps the EU is going to be very concerned about. The high tariffs averaging around 20% on Southeast Asian economies, and more so on some, including close to 40% on a couple of them, gives rise to the potential for significant trade diversion away from the US and into the European Union. And for instance, Vietnam has a trade relationship with the US of around 100 billion in exports every year, perhaps more so. And with the 20% tariffs it faces, alongside other restrictive measures, where will Vietnam look to as a potential market for its goods that will now possibly not reach US markets? And the obvious and most logical choice would have to be the European Union. There is a free trade agreement between Vietnam and the European Union, and tariffs have been almost basically pretty much reduced to zero between the two. But if there are sharp rises of Vietnamese exports into the European Union, and the European Union deems those to be basically a form of trade diversion, and it has a specific tool now, the import substitution tool, the import surveillance tool, that looks at sharp rises in imports, potentially from trade diversion. The question then comes down to, what will the European Union do in order to mitigate what could result as being significant trade diversion from the imposition of US tariffs on many Asian countries? So I think there are many, many questions ahead that really need to be resolved and looked at, and only ultimately, I believe, time will tell. Unfortunately so. And that's the way the world works nowadays. It's news travels fast and policy changes very quickly. And given that this is a framework agreement that will not just be dialogue, it will become a legal agreement. And this is why I fear that unless Asian countries establish legal agreements with the European Union, they can be effectively ignored. And the US has basically gotten one better with a legal agreement. Now, the framework agreement is only the beginning even. They will likely move to a much more extensive, comprehensive agreement. And I would say that it is something that needs to be very closely monitored, and Asian countries need to very, very sort of, I think, with microscopic detail, understand what is happening between. Well, that's an excellent question. Clearly, the framework agreement is pretty much directed against China, even though it does not mention China by name. But the inferences from terminology such as non-market economies and such like, and critical minerals, clearly the inference is China. There isn't any mention otherwise of any other Asian economy. But one has to also bear in mind the potential for trade diversion away from the United States into the European Union as basically the world's second largest consumer market. And the EU is very, very sensitive about potential trade diversion. Its own manufacturing has been in contraction, according to Purchasing Manager indices, for 3 years now, since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Its manufacturing is extremely weak by historic standards. So if you have significant trade diversion from places like Vietnam, as I've mentioned, plus many others, this could give rise to significant negative issues trade-wise between the European Union and other Asian economies. Yeah. That could be partly relevant. Again, the more opportunities there are for Asian economies to tie up with the European Union through legal agreements, the better. It is perhaps the greatest insurance policy they can have. It's not foolproof. As I've said, there is a free trade agreement between Vietnam and the European Union. Vietnam is a member of the CPTPP, as it's called. So it's a situation where I think that, to the extent that the more Asian economies conclude formal and legal agreements with the European Union, the better off they will be in ensuring that the consequences of at least trade diversion do not impact them negatively in the months and the years to come. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I think that there are not sufficient regulatory frameworks in place. There need to be more. There are, of course, negotiations over the EU-India free trade agreement. That is really a long time in coming, and that needs to be put into place as quickly as possible, I would say. The EU does have legal relations or regulatory relations with Japan and South Korea, so it protects those economies to some degree, but it doesn't have much in the way of legal relations or regulatory alignment with many Southeast Asian economies, and they're the ones that are most likely to suffer from the imposition of US tariffs and the potential for trade diversion that they'll have to undertake to relieve their economies of trade stress in the near future.